DevilNeverCry.
What is up everyone, it is me DevilNeverCry, and in today's video we're going to be talking about and reviewing Final Fantasy XVI's latest DLC, Echoes of the Fallen. A big thank you to Square Enix for providing me with a copy to review. With that said, let's dive into things. Echoes of the Fallen is one of two new DLCs for Final Fantasy XVI. It does take place towards the end of the game, so do be warned that there will be some spoilers in the video, though I'll try and keep the narrative fairly under wraps so that you can experience it for yourself. The DLC has an even mix of narrative, exposition, and combat, and roughly took me almost 3 hours to see to its completion. It is worth mentioning, however, that there are a few prerequisites to be able to access the DLC. The first of which is that you need to be at the point of no return before Clive and Co go on to tackle the final mission, and you'll need to have both Jill and Joshua permanently in your party, which means that you'll need to do both of their quest lines to their completion, allowing them to join you for the remainder of your time as Clive. With that said, let's talk about the overall narrative. As the name suggests, this DLC largely centers around the Fallen, the ancient civilization in Valisthea that existed way before the events of Final Fantasy XVI. Who were struck down from their city in the sky for their insolence in their attempt to reach the power of a god. I'm paraphrasing here, but you get the overall gist of it. Somewhat like Icarus, they flew too close to the sun, and that's when things came crashing down. This DLC largely centers and provides somewhat of an explanation as to why exactly that happened. And it all starts with Karen finding and bringing back a mysterious piece of crystal to the hideaway, to which Clive inquires what exactly it is and where it was found, before going off to see if he can find the origin point for this new format of crystal. The DLC front-loads a lot of the exposition right at the very start, and poses a few questions to try and get the player intrigued, which I think it does a fair enough job of, especially if you are interested in the world, story, and characters of Final Fantasy XVI. During your quest to uncover the truth, you're introduced to a few characters who are somewhat central to the story, or at least moving the narrative further. The DLC really begins to come alive, however, when you enter the game's new dungeon, the Sage Spire, which conveniently is located behind that closed door in the dim that everybody wondered what exactly it was when the game first came out. This new dungeon is where a majority of the new content lies. As little a detail as it may be, one of the things I really liked about the Sage Spire dungeon was its skybox and its aesthetic, this golden hour glow that it has, primarily because you spend a lot of the endgame of Final Fantasy XVI looking at this overcast, miserable, drab sky, which makes sense for the state of the world, but effectively eventually gets boring quite quickly. That wasn't the case here with the Sage Spire, and considering it's a fallen ruin, I think they did a really good job of making it look different to some of the other fallen ruins that you're able to see throughout the base game. As the name Sage Spire indicates, you're effectively going to have to fight your way from the bottom of this new tower all the way to the very top to find the answers that you seek, and along the way, you'll be introduced to a myriad of new things, the first of which is going to be new enemies. Some of them are somewhat similar to enemies that you've seen in the base game, but they really begin to come alive and come into their own, particularly when you're facing off against a lot of the mini-bosses, the sub-bosses, and the bosses themselves. I think they've done a really good job of introducing these new enemy types that will effectively keep you on your toes even if you have beaten the game already. I came into this dungeon around level 48, playing on New Game where the level cap is 50, and despite the fact that I was able to absolutely rinse a lot of enemies in the base game of this level, the enemies and particularly the bosses here put up a really good fight. Beyond the aesthetic and the attack patterns of the enemies, they've also added in a new mechanic, particularly with the goblins, where they're able to cast the Hearth Flame spell. Think of the Hearth Flame as a bastardized Will-o'-the-Wisps that enemies are able to use, where if you attack them with a melee attack, Clive will go rebounding away and take damage, meaning that you'll effectively have to use magic to deplete this initial shield first before going in for the kill. It's only a small detail, I know, but it effectively provided for a nice change of pace during combat, forcing you to stop being aggressive all the time and perhaps plan out your moves a bit more carefully. Also included in this dungeon was a plethora of new accessories that are definitely worth keeping an eye out for. Being able to cut down the recovery time of used skills as well as regaining health, provided you're able to pull off a perfect dodge, or even an accessory that better signposts parry timing for enemies that also provides greater slowdown. There was even an accessory that increased the stagger rate and actually broke the limit of 150 and pushed it all the way up to 200. As someone who didn't effectively think all too much about accessories, particularly just going for the ones that maximized my damage output, it was nice to have all these different options that pretty much forced me to consider whether or not I wanted to give up some of that extra damage for some of these cooler, more interesting buffs. One of the things that really stuck out to me as I made my way through the tower was the soundtrack, the new tracks that were made specifically for this DLC that really served to heighten the overall experience. Whether it was the sense of foreboding walking through some of these cavernous hallways, or the music that gets your blood pumping, particularly during that final encounter, which I'll touch upon in just a second. But honestly, the new tracks made for this DLC are on par with the base game, which coincidentally I believe won the Golden Joystick Award this year for Best Audio, which, considering the game's music, definitely makes sense. But safe to say, if you're a fan of the base game soundtrack, you're gonna love what's on offer here. Continuing our way along the tower, fighting enemies, soaking in the vista, you're gonna come across different devlogs left by the Fallen, which further serve to add exposition to the narrative of the DLC, somewhat explaining what exactly awaits for you up at the top of this very tower, alongside explaining perhaps how these different new crystals came to be. Making our way to the top of the tower with pretty much nowhere else left to go, there's only one thing left to do, and that's face off against Omega. We got to see small glimpses of this fight during the trailer for the DLC, but quite honestly, I don't think any of that prepares you for this fight. Similar to the game's final boss, the fight compounds and gets bigger and bigger and bigger and tougher the longer that the fight goes on, ultimately reaching a crescendo. And it's safe to say that I honestly think that this boss here and what's on offer is a lot harder than the final boss of Final Fantasy XVI. Omega is a household name in Final Fantasy history, so as soon as you see the name pop up upside that health bar, you pretty much know you're in for the long haul. After a long and arduous battle, you finally begin to realize why exactly it is that the Fallen had to fall, or why they were struck down, especially considering how powerful Omega is and the ramifications for some of the powers he has or what he tries to pull off at the end of the fight. But safe to say, it's a rather climactic finish to honestly what I consider to be a very strong DLC, particularly if you're somebody that really enjoys the combat. And that ultimately leads me to my overall thoughts and feelings on this DLC. If you're somebody that purely really enjoys Final Fantasy XVI just for the combat, I think there's definitely enough here to keep you satiated. If you're somebody who's interested in the narrative of Final Fantasy XVI and you want to know more about the world of Valisthea, particularly about the Fallen and some of the history and details behind why they fell, then again I think this DLC is definitely worth investing in. Considering how much I enjoyed this DLC, I'm definitely going to be picking up the next one, The Rising Tide, which apparently is almost 2 to 3 times the scale of what we have here, and as we've seen from some of the trailers, is likely to dive into the history of Leviathan, the missing icon. But that about wraps it up for my brief review of Final Fantasy XVI's Echoes of the Fallen. If you want more Final Fantasy content, then definitely subscribe as there's more on the way, and be sure to leave a comment down below letting me know what your thoughts are on this DLC, and particularly the final boss. With all that said and done, it has been me, DevilNeverCry. I want to thank all of you for watching, and as always, I'll see you all next video.